Good evening, and welcome to the annual Bechtel Lectures in Anabaptist-Mennonite Studies, Part 2. I am Lorraine Harder-Gissing, Archivist and Librarian at Conrad Grebel, and I'm also the Director of the Institute of Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies. And I must confess I am responsible for that display back there tonight. I saw a number of people walking by that display with very puzzled looks. Why on earth did she put those things together? So I'll say more about that later, or maybe during the course of the evening it will become clear. Before we go any further, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Bechtel family for their generous support of this lecture series. In the year 2000, Lester Bechtel provided a gift to the college, which would allow us to offer annual lectures to nurture the understanding of Anabaptist and Mennonite faith and traditions. The lectures have been offered every year since then, and on a wide range of topics. We thank you, Lester, who is sitting here in the second row with his family, for creating this opportunity for the college and community. So last night we heard from our 2018 lecturer, Dr. David Weaver-Zercher, who helped us consider how stories of persecution in the martyr sphere have been used to engage, or sometimes intentionally to disengage, Anabaptist youth. Tonight we will be gazing into a different kind of mirror. In 1960, this photograph was published in the Kitchener-Waterloo Record with the following caption, capital letters, Mennonite Resistance. A young couple's attempt to photograph activities at Elmira's Old Order Mennonite Meeting House was thwarted this weekend when Mennonites used hand mirrors to reflect the sun's glare into their camera. Mennonite elders inside the hall gave their useful counterparts outside permission to use the mirrors as a subtle but effective means of fighting intrusion from tourists. Tonight's theme is Mennonites and the media, telling Mennonite stories today. How do we as Mennonites tell our stories? What are the challenges our storytellers face? How do we respond when non-Mennonite storytellers get it wrong? These are some of the questions we will be considering tonight. In addition to David Weaver-Zercher, we will hear from a panel of people telling Mennonite stories today. The moderator for this evening is Dr. Marlene Epp, Dean of Conrad Grebel, and I will now turn the evening over to her.
Thanks, Lorraine, and I'll add my welcome to all of you here tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are here on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples, indigenous peoples that lived on this land. Conrad Grebel University College is situated on what we know here as the Haldimand Tract, which was land given in treaty to the Six Nations in 1784 and consisted of 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from end to end. I think it's important to make that acknowledgement here tonight because it is very much about how we tell and represent Mennonite stories and how we represent the Mennonite past. It's an honor to moderate this panel. The overall title for the Bechtel Lecture series this year, as you can see on your program, is Bloody Theater, Bloodless Theater. I think last night we had the Bloody Theater, and so tonight is the, hopefully, I don't know what can happen in a panel, is the Bloodless Theater. So we decided to put together a panel of individuals who put ideas and debates about Mennonites out there in public venues, particularly social media and artistic media, or speak to the media about Mennonites and Amish. In many ways, it is these folk, not me, who does Mennonite history, these folk who are on the forefront of presenting who Mennonites are and why are they that way, or even who they should be or shouldn't be. They're all telling Mennonite stories today in very different ways. So our four panelists will each speak about 10 minutes about their particular media voice. And then we will hear a talk and response from Dr. David Weaver-Zercher, this year's Bechtel Lecturer in Anabaptist-Mennonite Studies. We'll hear about his own experience of representing Mennonites and Amish to the media and elsewhere, and then we'll have a conversation. Dr. Weaver-Zercher is here from Messiah College in Pennsylvania, where he teaches American religious history and publishes widely on Mennonite and Amish topics, including how those groups are represented in public places. You can see a short list of his publications on your program. And as Lorene said, last night we heard a wonderful lecture about the use and perhaps abuse of the martyr's mirror as a teaching tool for youth over the centuries. So after the panelists and Dave have both all spoken, I'll invite some exchange among them, and then we'll open up the conversation to you, the audience. So I'm going to introduce our four panelists, and I'm going to maybe just ask them to stand when I say their name, and then they will come up and speak after I introduce them in the order that I'm introducing them. So first we'll hear from Sam Steiner. Sam was the librarian archivist at Conrad Grebel for many years, retiring at the end of 2008. He's written a history of Mennonites in Ontario called In Search of Promised Lands, and has been an editor of the Global Anabaptist-Mennonite Encyclopedia Online, known as GAMEO, since 1996. Sherri Klassen is a Mennonite blogger and Twitter personality who grew up in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, attending Sterling Avenue Mennonite Church, and she now lives in Toronto and attends Toronto United Mennonite Church. She has a PhD in history, but not in Mennonite history. That's okay, Sherri. You put this in here, I thought, because by day she puts her academic skills to work helping sociology researchers at the University of Toronto write grant applications and promote their research. By night, she makes fun of Mennonites on the internet. And she's been writing about Mennonites since 2015. Johnny Wideman is a playwright, actor, short story writer, and the artistic director of Theatre of the Beat. He founded the Faith Wrestling Social Justice Theatre Company in 2011, and they've since gone on to perform 260 shows across Canada and the US. In 2015, he was the recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award from Conrad Grebel University College for his play titled This Will Lead to Dancing, which examined LGBTQ inclusion in the Mennonite Church. This past November, he published his first book called To Aid Digestion, a collection of short stories and poems. Katie Steckly is a student here at University of Waterloo, currently completing her final year studying English, rhetoric, media, and professional communication with a specialization in digital media studies and minors in peace and conflict studies and Mennonite studies. Yes, she fit all that into one degree. In addition to her studies, Katie is an avid YouTube creator, producing videos about travel, technology, creativity, and Mennonites. Katie also puts her love of video into practice in her business K19 Studio, where she produces social media and video marketing content for small businesses and nonprofit organizations. So please join me in welcoming our four panelists together, and then I'll invite Sam.
My blog at OntarioMennoniteHistory.org began as strictly a commercial venture. I began it in December 2014, several months before my book, In Search of Promised Lands, was to be published by Herald Press, so that the title of the blog that people saw reflected the title of the book. I'd never done a blog before, but one of the promotional avenues that Herald Press wanted me to pursue was the use of social media. I was already active on Facebook, so posting the blog there was a piece of cake. But this meant I also had to open a Twitter account, become an author on the Goodreads website with a link to the blog, and also fed into the business-oriented social media site LinkedIn. I thought the target audience for my blog would be similar to what I imagined it to be for the book. Mennonites with roots in Ontario who were interested in the story of their history, non-Mennonites who had a Mennonite heritage they wanted to explore, people interested in the background of religious movements, and students probably mostly at the university level or beyond. In some ways, I saw both the book and the blog as an insider writing because of the amount of specific detail that I often included. For the first year or so of the blog, I mostly included small stories or themes out of my book. Most of the early blogs got 100 to 200 views. Some, particularly when I was talking about an individual leader or early pioneer, got less than 100. Most of the feedback I've received, and this has been true throughout the life of the blog, came through Facebook, either through likes or through comments about that particular blog's content on my Facebook page. Twitter reaction was a very distant second. The number of responses on the blog itself were relatively minimal, though one included a threat against the Low German Mennonite community in the Leamington area. Enough of a threat that a friend of mine thought that it should be reported to the police, and he eventually did so himself. I also received feedback from a surprising number of people in personal conversation who would refer to a blog post I had done when I had no idea that they were following it at all. In 2015 and 2016, I had about 11,500 views in total during each year. This changed in 2017 when I had over 30,000 views. And this increase was primarily traceable to my response to a CBC drama series of 6 episodes called Pure. The series told the story of a horse and buggy Mennonite group in southern Ontario that was big time into drug dealing, with the community's pastor and wife playing large roles in the criminal activity. I essentially wrote a review after each episode and got progressively more irate as the violence increased and some of the symbolism used seemed to mock the Old Order Mennonite community, a group I knew would not defend itself in the public sphere. Then, even more disgusting to me, was a program by CBC's flagship news feature program, The Fifth Estate, that presumed to analyze the Low German Mennonite involvement in drug activity between Mexico and southern Ontario. It was badly researched and was little more than a shill for the Pure drama series that was running at the same time, and it conflated the Old Order Mennonites and Low German Mennonites. Actually, the blog I wrote on the Fifth Estate program has been one of my favorites. And I welcome you to go and look it up sometime. These blogs generated quite a lot of response, but primarily from people who agreed with my perspective. I was reminded constantly through the whole blog process that social media really is mostly an echo chamber that brings together like-minded people. It was interesting for me to look back at the 144 blogs that I've written to see which were the most read items and which were the least read items. Consistently, I learned that blogs about individual people or institution, including my post on Conrad Grebel University College, received relatively little readership. I'm sure part of this was my style. I write historical narrative and summary, and not a lot of entertaining stories. My most successful blogs have been on themes or particular topics, especially when related to things that have a profile in the popular news world. You'll see this as I review the 10 blog posts that have received the highest readership since December 2014. First was my first post on Pure, the CBC drama, episode 1, on which I got 3,500 views. Second was a blog entitled "It Can Happen in Canada, Immigration by Mennonites Prohibited." This one got 2,500 views and recounted the Canadian government's decision in 1919 to prohibit Hutterite and Mennonite immigration into Canada. This ban was only rescinded in 1922. This is also the blog in which the reader made a threat against the Low German Mennonites in Leamington. Donald Trump's exclusion of Muslims from the United States was much in the news at the same time that this blog appeared. The reader, who was irate, said he still didn't want Mennonites in Canada and made reference to a gun he had that could help solve the problem. The third blog was my blog on CBC, the Fifth Estate, and the Mennonite Mob. I've already mentioned this one, and that the news department of our national broadcaster would produce such bad news analysis still makes me mad when I think about it. Fourth was one on Ontario Mennonites and Aboriginal residential schools. This was a relatively early blog post that I think benefited from all the publicity about my residential schools in the last couple of years. The fifth one was a bit of an outlier. It was called Menopause, a Personal Reflection. This was an outlier because it was a personal autobiographical reflection on part of my experience that ended up with me living in Canada, and probably benefited from the appeal it had to U.S. Mennonites who went to Goshen College in Indiana in the late 1960s. Sixth was a blog on the explosive growth of the Old Colony Mennonites, and I think this probably related to the interest in Old Colony Mennonites around the Pure Drama series. Seventh was the Old Colony Mennonite school system in Ontario. Eighth was Mennonites, slavery, and black immigration to Canada. This was an early post and has always had steady but not great readership at any particular time. Ninth was the Amish on Prince Edward Island. This was a new post from last summer that I think tapped into the large interest in North America on old order Amish stories generally. And 10th was one on Mennonite Church Eastern Canada and diversity. This one actually surprised me since it's a very inside Mennonite blog about one Mennonite regional conference, but it did reference Mennonite Church USA and the travails it has gone through in the past couple of years, which may have broadened the appeal of the article. Other blog posts on the CBC Pure episodes finished 11th, 13th, and 17th on my list of blogs. A fairly new article from last October on Mennonites and homosexuality sits at number 14 and will likely move into the top 10 in the coming months. A couple of other observations about the popular posts. About half of them were rooted in the content of my book, and half of them were not. Certainly the most successful blogs were related to content that was also in the public eye in the mainstream or public media. Writing a regular blog is hard work. Sometimes I took shortcuts featuring articles from the Global Mennonite Encyclopedia, usually about leading figures from Ontario, especially from articles that I had written myself, but sometimes others as well. But these were never as popular, probably because the encyclopedia style is not nearly as engaging as another kind of narrative. I'm not certain that I'll return to blogging. I essentially stopped a couple of months ago, partly because of the time involved in generating content, but I did enjoy very much the 3 years that I worked on it. Thank you.
I decided to talk about making fun of Mennonites. And I do recognize that there are people who might not find making fun of Mennonites to be an enjoyable or respectable activity. Some of you in the audience, perhaps, are people who shook your finger at your children and told them no sputting. Well, here I am trying to make the case for making sput of Mennonites. We can all imagine the arguments against making sput. It could be profaning the sacred. It might mean that some people's feelings get hurt. And the kicker, it might give the outside world the wrong impression of us and thus diminish our evangelical potential. I don't hold much stock in the concern for profaning the sacred. That may just reflect my personal irreverence or have broader theological underpinnings. But as I only have 10 minutes, I can't go into a long disputation on the theology of sput making. I'm sure you'd all love it if I did, though. I will say, in my case, profaning the sacred means putting words together like drunken and Mennonite, and writing rambling discussions about Mennonite stuff matched with cocktail recipes. And moving. There, no, wrong way. Where is our, to move to the next. There we go. So that is my Twitter profile. Because this is what I write. My corner of the internet has me taking on the persona of a disaffected Mennonite, it's not too hard, who writes and tweets about Mennonite stuff and provides Mennonite-themed cocktail recipes. I call myself the Drunken Mennonite on Twitter, and my blog is the Drunken Menno blog. I'm not actually usually drunk when I write or tweet, but I do let my inhibitions down a bit. See if I can see this one. Ah, no, there. This tweet, I think, encapsulates some of the humor of my irreverence. Those of you here last night might appreciate this as a representing the dilemma of an assimilated Mennonite confronting the legacy of martyrdom. But I recognize that not everyone will find this funny. I just want to pause here for a minute and to say if there is anyone in the audience who is offended at the notion of a Mennonite cocktail blog, or someone calling herself the Drunken Mennonite, I suggest right now that you avert your eyes from the screen, quickly stop up your ears and spend the rest of my time talking, imagining yourself singing 606 or 118, whichever. Don't actually sing it, please, because that would be disruptive, but it would be more pleasant for all of us if you could give the appearance of enjoying yourself. Okay, so now that all of my family members have their fingers in their ears, let's get back to my argument with the imaginary people saying no to making spot of Mennonites. You'll remember that the second argument was that I might hurt people's feelings. I actually try not to do that, and I avoid mocking real, living, identifiable individuals. I speak to institutions, archetypes, historical people, general trends, the content of writings, the person who wrote it, and my own life, which actually gives me plenty of material. That probably doesn't mean that I never ruffle anyone's feathers, but I do think also that the name of the blog should serve as fair warning to anyone expecting nothing but glowing reports of Mennonite perfection. I assume that the easily offended will not appreciate the humor of a project titled The Drunken Mennonite, and will stay away from my little piece of the internet. And for the most part, they have. Certainly, the stats on the number of people who regularly read my blog suggest that I still have a pretty niche audience. I just, at the risk of going over my minute, just to my comparison, like Sam, I had my pure my blog posts that talked about pure were also sort of at the top, but mostly I'm not topical, so there it is. When I started writing, I didn't really imagine that my audience would be people so embedded in the Mennonite world that they would, for instance, show up at Conrad Grebel lecture series things. I imagine my audience as people on the fringes of the Mennonite universe. I do have a number of readers and Twitter followers who follow that, who fit that profile. But I've also found that a number of people are less fringe than I expected. Maybe that's because everybody feels just a little bit fringe at some point or another, or maybe I'm just not as edgy as I thought. I do know that some of my readers still feel a bit subversive when they log on to the Drunken Mennonite site or follow me on Twitter, especially the pastors. I hope they enjoyed that little free solo rebellion. I initially thought the blog might also be fun for those non-Mennonites out there who are just Menno curious, but that really didn't work. Except on rare occasions, my audience is almost entirely Mennonite. Non-Mennonites who love us, and there are some, don't read me lest I tarnish their image of us with my drunkenness, or which is really what I mean by my irreverence. And those who hate us are uninterested in hearing, and there are also people who hate us, in hearing about our Mennoniteness, which actually should really put to rest the third objection to publicly spotting about Mennonites. And that one, if you've forgotten, is that the outside world might get the wrong impression. But they're really not reading me, so I don't really think we have to worry about that. But I don't think that that objection is really just about non-Mennonites. I think we want the world to see us as peacemaking, hardworking, harmonizing, Mennonite relief cell attending, good Christians willing to die for our faith, because that's how we want to see ourselves. And we don't really want to see ourselves as a bickering people, as a people really very sensitive to what outsiders think of us, as a people with a past as messy as any other people, as a people who aren't always good to each other, even though really it's so much funnier if we do. And again, in a way that all sort of the lives and efforts of ordinary, flawed human beings are funny. Anyway, you can usually count on the official Mennonite sources to turn the world away from seeing our flaws. Nobody needs me for that. But I'm afraid that none of this is really very convincing anyone about how much fun it is to make fun of Mennonites. So I want to close with just a couple of tweets that will, I hope, do a better job. So I wrote a blog, so that's long-form writing that anybody can just go to at any time, and it's really just me speaking, and you get a cocktail recipe, and you should just pick a topic and then ramble about it. I hope you'll take a look. Mennonite Twitter, on the other hand, for those of you unfamiliar with Twitter, it's more like a community, and there's a conversation. So I'm going to show some of my own tweets, but all of them are embedded in a conversation. So if I get this going the right way. Oh, sorry. This is very sensitive. So I'm not sure how well you can read the small print of this one. I like this one because I got to bring together something current and fairly funny with our history of breaking into schisms. Mennonite Twitter in general had a certain amount of fun with Herald Press sending out an internet survey that asked us to rank the hymn book cover texture. I don't know if any of you guys, you guys saw that internet survey. Part of actually what I like about this is I'm not really sure whether Herald Press was in on it and they knew it was funny, that they were just kind of pranking us all by asking us to rank this on the internet, or whether they really think that we're in such a culture that we need to consult on everything, even in a sort of meaningless way. So I don't know. I know I could probably contact Herald Press, but I kind of prefer not knowing. It's funnier. And so I don't know if you can read that. It's a screenshot of the survey, and the tweet above it is latest Mennonite Church schism predicted over hymn book texture choices. No, so this is there we go. So a lot of my tweets are inside jokes that only fellow Mennonites appreciate. Okay, I can see this audience, yes, this one. And often there's only a subset of Mennonites who get them. I included this tweet on the assumption that we wouldn't get through yesterday's talk without at least one Dirk Willems reference. We almost made it. It only came in the question and answer part, but here it is. So there's really no limit to the number of Dirk Willems jokes that the internet can hold. I made this one because it was National Dog Day. You might not have known about that holiday. And on that day, a lot of people were posting pictures of their dogs with some cute or clever saying. Now, this is obvious. It's obviously an inside joke. And inside jokes can work to sort of exclude people who aren't in the know. But Twitter, one of the things, I say it's a community. Everybody there is sort of an insider and an outsider at the same time. Nobody gets all of the jokes, and everybody gets a few of them. Okay, see if I can get to the last slide here. There. So one of the most enjoyable parts of Mennonite Twitter happens when we have a hashtag game. We did one last Christmas that was Make a Christmas Movie Mennonite. I didn't put a slide of that one. Quite a number of people jumped in. Maybe somebody in the room. Anybody here on Twitter? No? Oh, yes, a couple people. And altered the name of a movie to make it reflect something a bit more Mennonite. And it ranges from puns on ethnic Mennonite names to church jokes. This one here is from a hashtag game called Mennonite Valentine's. And it obviously rips off my own ethnic background. But one of the fun things about this game is that others chime in from all around the Mennonite Twitter sphere. And so we get variations from different ethnic traditions and variations of religious culture, which I think is pretty neat. Because, I know that we don't all have Spivak. But I do think that if we try really, really, really hard, we can all have fun.
How do I get back? Okay, 1 second.
You never get back.
Yeah. Oh, jeepers, I'm sorry. I'm not very good at computers. Thank you very much. My name is Johnny Wideman. I'm the artistic director of Theater of the Beat. So this was thank you so much for doing that. That was a clip from one of our shows called Yellow Bellies. Yellow Bellies was our most recent production, which looked specifically at Mennonite conscientious objectors during World War II and the kind of alternative service that they were a part of. So I would say that is one of our more Mennonite-themed pieces. The play before that, Marlene mentioned, was called This Will Lead to Dancing, and that looked specifically at LGBTQ inclusion within the Mennonite Church. Before that, most of our plays were fairly issue-based in terms of looking at healthy relationships, which we looked at with Shalom Counseling as well as Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. We did another play called Forgiven Forgotten, which looked at restorative justice, so that was kind of made in partnership with Mennonite Central Committee Ontario. And then our very first play was about a fellow who is just up here named Sam Steiner, and also featured Sue as well. So our plays have existed very much within Mennonite communities, and then have also looked at themes or topics that are kind of relevant to the Mennonite community, which we have found is a fairly niche market. I think you also use the word niche as well. So theater on its own is a tough business to be in. Social justice theater, even tougher business to be in. Like Mennonite-specific social justice theater, it's just about the toughest business you can find yourself a part of. But that's not to say that it's not very life-giving and very exciting. And I think Theater of the Beat is very lucky in some ways to have such a niche market, because it's given us an audience. It's given us an audience that we understand. It's given us an audience that we care about, that we're passionate about. But it's also given us an audience that has provided us with more than just bums and seats at our shows. We have toured all over Canada. We've performed in every province but Newfoundland and Labrador. I guess there's not many Mennonites that far east. We've performed in the US, and we've kind of built our touring structure around the hospitality of this community. So one of the ways that we've basically been able to afford doing what we do is that we don't pay for venues, and we don't pay for accommodations, and we get paid to do what we do. So we will often come into a church, and we will set up our set and our props and our little merch table, and we will kind of take over the sanctuary, which, depending on the content of our play or the language in the play, has been problematic in the past. We've been told that we weren't allowed to perform in the sanctuary, but that they would have us in the basement. We've been told that we just couldn't move certain things. So it is a bit of a unique obstacle to performing in a sanctuary. But then in terms of our billets, we're trapped. We are lovely, like our hosts welcome us into their homes. We stay in their guest beds, which are typically, the retired beds that you don't really actually want to have to sleep on for a long period of time. But we're fed at Mennonite tables. And when I say Mennonite tables, I mean your plates are never, ever empty, and you are treated very, very well. Several of our troupe members turned vegetarian, which proved to be very difficult for touring. We had a lot of people ask, what can we serve as vegetarian food? But for the most part, we've been treated very, very kindly by the Mennonite community as we tour around, doing shows that are about issues that affect the Mennonite community. Now, in some ways, we've kind of got ourselves into trouble, because theater as an art form is not growing. People aren't going to plays as they used to go to plays. Church as a community is not growing. You could argue with me about this, but I think in many cases, the recent stats that I found is about 80% of Canadian youth who grew up in a church community do not continue to go to church as they become an adult. So when we're basing our theater and our community off of this kind of, very niche market, then it's a very interesting place to find ourselves in. We like to say that we're like the center of a Venn diagram, that little football shape in the middle that exists between the theater community and between the Mennonite or church community. And sometimes that has us feeling like the lukewarm water that gets spit out, because when it comes to grants, we are considered too religious for a government grant. When it comes to performing in churches, we are considered far too secular to be performing in churches. And so it's created a very interesting tension for us. It feels like we have found ourselves at the intersection of where theater finds itself today in this modern context and where church finds itself today in this modern context, which is an exciting place to be if you're willing to get your hands dirty and ask difficult questions and sometimes get yourself into trouble, which we've done. And that's kind of fun. So we like to be at that central spot. I guess some of the challenges that we face is that theater, as a medium, as an art form, is very ephemeral. You can come and you can see a play, and if you've experienced it, you're a part of it, but then it's done, and it's over, and it's dissipated, and it can't be recommodified, and it can't be repeated, which to me, as an activist, is something that gives theater power. If something can't be commodified, if it can't be replicated, it's hard to misappropriate it. And there's something very live and reciprocal about a theater performance and the connection that it creates with a community. And I think that that is part of why I love working with the Mennonite community. Because, as Sherri pointed out, they're willing to be made fun of. They're willing to be poked. They're willing to be pushed. They're willing to be called to action. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing about creating social justice theater for a community that wants to be better at being socially conscious. When peace is built into kind of the ethos of a community, when serving others is built into the ethos of a community, it's very easy to point back at these things and say, hey, look at this thing we hold dear. Are we actually doing that? If not, why? Here is a play about some of the reasons why we should consider this thing. And so we're actually able to see our plays invoke change with a community that's actually willing to listen, which is wonderful, because not only do we have an audience, which many theater companies don't today, many theater companies are trying to find an audience, we have an audience that is also not only willing to listen, but is willing to change as well. And that's really meaningful to me as an artist who's putting a year into writing a play, to know that it's actually being listened to and it's actually being considered and wrestled with. That's just about the most important thing an artist can look for or can want. I guess one of the things that I found about the Mennonite community, so Ted Swartz, Ted and Company, Ted and Lee, for those of you who know, is a theater maker within the Mennonite community in the US. He's probably the only other person that I know who's trying to do kind of Mennonite theater, and so he's become a bit of a mentor to me. And very early on, he gave a workshop to our company, actually in the Grebel chapel, and he said that Mennonites are a very interesting group, and if you find yourself on the inside of their walls, you can push against those walls. You can stretch those walls, and those people will be willing to stretch with you. But the second that you're on the outside of those walls, they will do everything that they can to hold those walls where they are and to protect what is going on inside of those walls, inside that community. And that's become a very interesting idea for us. As we started to realize that the majority of our audience was Mennonites and that we were going to be trying to create, in a way, Mennonite content with our plays, it became important for us to show that we were a part of this community. Last names certainly help, but it helped to actually be a part of the community, to be able to crack jokes that Mennonites would laugh at, those kind of inside jokes like you were talking about, to kind of remind that, yeah, we are part of this community, we love this community, and that's why we're causing such a ruckus about this community, because we see what it's capable of, and we know where it can go, and we're going to keep kind of kicking the bee's nest and doing that. I think, okay. So I guess the idea of what do we do when non-Mennonites kind of get it wrong, or if non-Mennonites tell these stories? I am not Mennonite. I have a Mennonite last name, and I went to Conrad Grebel because I heard they had really good cookies, and I was kind of tricked into this whole thing. I fell in love with a Mennonite woman whose last name is harder, so I got to learn the kind of Russian Mennonites, kind of Saskatchewan area kind of way of doing things. And where I'm from in Stouffville, I was just completely oblivious to it, but it's a very Swiss Mennonite region. And so I've kind of become ingrained in both sides of the Mennonite world. And I learned that if we say something, especially if I'm writing the plays and I get it wrong, then I hear about it from the Mennonite community. But what I also find is that the Mennonite community is willing to listen, but they also expect you to listen as well. And so I'm very honored to be considered a voice in this community, and I'm very grateful for the platform that we've been given with our theater and our shows.
to our channel. My name's Katie, and I'm a Mennonite. How many Mennonites does it take to screw in a light bulb? 15. Can start a committee to decide how to screw the light bulb and 5 to make the meal for afterwards. Mennonites are known for their extensive committees and conferences. You see Leanne being so genuine and forward about her faith, and you also see Leanne talking about how the representation of her faith is inaccurate in the media. Overall, I think they did a good job of not simplifying it to either the breaking Amish robe kind of view or the infantilized and naive version. The following are real questions asked by real people who really don't understand Mennonites. You're Mennonite? Shouldn't you be wearing a dress or overalls or something? Oh shoot! You're right. Oh my gosh, I forgot my dress at home. I wore jeans by accident. Oh my gosh. And until next time, Dr. Shane, thanks for watching.
So good evening, everyone. As the video said, my name is Katie and I'm a Mennonite. And I also happen to be a YouTuber. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar, YouTube is an online platform for sharing videos. Can I see my link? Anyway, it is an online platform for sharing videos where users can upload videos for others to watch and to engage with and to comment on. So you can subscribe to YouTube channels, and if that interested you, I would encourage you to subscribe to mine. You can go to katiesteckly.com/Menno, and it will bring you to this page right here, and if you click that little red button, then you can subscribe to my videos and you'll be notified every time they're posted. I just had to take my chance to say that. So anyway, that being said, the first question that I wanted to address this evening is, what is it like to be a creator of Mennonite media content? So for me, being a creator of Mennonite content for the online world has always been about striking a balance between humor and education, and also striking a balance between speaking to a Mennonite and a non-Mennonite audience. Because my videos are posted online, the audience has the potential to be worldwide, and actually is worldwide, and is viewed by people of all backgrounds, Mennonite and non-Mennonite. So one of the biggest challenges that I have found is often feeling like the default representation for Mennonites on YouTube. There aren't that many of us, so YouTube is my platform of choice for posting my videos, and as you may have guessed, there aren't a lot of us on there. So often I am one of the few Mennonites that my non-Mennonite audience has come across in their lives. So I struggle with being a bit of an assumed ambassador for all Mennonites, which I definitely don't feel qualified to be. But on the flip side of this, one great advantage I've found to being a Mennonite content creator is that I already have an audience built into my work. So while on one hand I struggle to find a large audience out in the real world, because of how niche, like others have said, a topic being Mennonite is, on the other hand, I've had a lot of success within Mennonite circles. I've really enjoyed the feedback that I've gotten from Mennonite viewers, and I always love to run into people at Mennonite events or at a new church who recognize me from my videos. So speaking of viewers, who is my audience? So my audience is a really interesting mix of people. Estimates that I've gathered just from my comments would indicate that about half of my audience is Mennonite, while the other half is not. The Mennonites who watch my videos are people that I believe are seeking out content that they feel represents their own experience. For them, I think that they get the most out of being in on the joke, appreciating those inside jokes for Mennonites. They can relate to the misconceptions and to the stereotypes that my videos attempt to debunk. For the other half of my audience, they're interested in the Mennonite faith and culture, so they go seeking out information online. So they search Mennonite on YouTube, and I come up as one of the top results. So they find themselves, often, confronted with a person who is not at all what they expected from a Mennonite. Sometimes this leads to really positive feedback, and other times it can lead to really negative feedback. Just as I said before, going on estimates from my comment section, it would seem that a fair amount of my non-Mennonite viewers do not believe that I am Mennonite. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, a fair amount of my Mennonite viewers also don't believe that. So what are the challenges of telling Mennonite stories? For me, I think the biggest challenge of telling Mennonite stories online is that I can really only tell my own.
And in my particular realm, for a lot of my viewers, I might be the only Mennonite they've ever met, if you can call watching a video online meeting someone. Either way, I might be the only or the first representation of Mennonites that someone comes across, and that feels like a really big responsibility. When I tell my story as a Mennonite, sometimes I worry that it erases or diminishes the stories of other Mennonites. For instance, a number of my videos focus on the stereotype that all Mennonites are plain people. In my own life experience, the number one question that I get asked when people find out that I'm Mennonite is if I drive a horse and buggy, or if my house has electricity. It's actually that sense of misrepresentation or misconception that really led me to start my YouTube series in the first place. So while a lot of my videos focus on telling people that the story of assimilated Mennonites, pointing out that in fact we don't all drive horse and buggies, sometimes I do worry that I'm diminishing the experiences or the value of the plain lifestyle for many Mennonites. However, I do feel that I can only tell my own story. I don't think that I have the authority to speak to other Mennonite experiences unless I can somehow directly use their voices in my videos, which hasn't really been the case so far, especially for plain Mennonites. So why tell Mennonite stories? Something that I'm really passionate about in general is media representation. So outside of the Mennonite context, for me, that means television shows and movies, providing representation for women and for people of color, as well as other minority groups. I think that seeing oneself in the media one consumes can be so important for the development of self-esteem, especially for young people. I feel the same way about Mennonites. I've always found it so rewarding to see Mennonites or Anabaptists in general represented in media. One story in particular that I remember from my childhood is watching the kids' TV show Arthur, where their 4th grade class went on a field trip to an Amish barn raising, and one of the characters, Buster Baxter, tried to become Amish following that experience. And when I was young, I was thrilled to see something that was a part of my own local community and my culture represented on a TV show that I watched every day, even if the portrayal was a bit inaccurate. So for some context, I grew up in an area where I was surrounded not only by assimilated Mennonites, but also Old Order Mennonites and Amish people. So I was very excited, as a 7-year-old to see Buster Baxter trying to be Amish. So I want to be able to provide that kind of representation for other people, and hopefully a somewhat more accurate and relatable representation of that. I often get comments that speak to this issue, people who have moved away from their Mennonite community and have found comfort and familiarity with the content that I post online. I always find this so rewarding because for many people, their Mennonite background is an important part of their story, and it can be something that one is easily disconnected with if one is no longer living in an area with a Mennonite community or Mennonite churches. So I feel that it is a privilege to be able to help people reconnect with their Mennonite background, even if it is through something as small as a YouTube video. So who gets to tell these Mennonite stories? The question of who gets to tell Mennonite stories is a complicated one for me. Obviously, there have been many times that non-Mennonites have told Mennonite stories and made considerable errors in accuracy, the Pure series being one of those. However, I'm not sure that for me this means that only Mennonites should be able to tell Mennonite stories. I also think that maybe the definition of a Mennonite story is an important question as well. Is any story about me Mennonite by definition because I am Mennonite? Or does it require some Mennonite content? I'm not sure I have a good answer to this question, but I think that in general, where Mennonite stories are told, there really ought to be some Mennonite input somewhere along the line of production. But I don't think that I would necessarily take a hardline stance that only Mennonites have the right to tell stories about us. So how do we respond then when the non-Mennonite media gets it wrong? I think that we can probably all think of a number of times, that episode of Arthur included, where we felt that the media has misrepresented Anabaptists or Mennonites in some particular way. This phenomena of seemingly constant misrepresentation in the media is partly what inspired me to start my YouTube channel. So in my own personal case, how do I respond when the non-Mennonite media gets it wrong? Well, usually I make a YouTube video about it. One of my example clips was responding to an episode of Orange is the New Black where a character had an Amish backstory. In that case, I think they actually did a pretty good job of it. But I like to counter these usual misrepresentations by sharing my own perspectives in videos. These types of videos are usually well received by viewers because people are interested in knowing what real Mennonites think about these things. However, the issue that I run into time and time again is that I can't personally debunk every Mennonite misrepresentation. A lot of times I can't guarantee that it necessarily is misrepresentation because Mennonite and Anabaptist faith and culture vary significantly by region and even by church. In general, though, I personally feel that every time the non-Mennonite media gets the Mennonite story wrong is just another opportunity for me to get it right. Or, in other words, to present another perspective. Thank you.
Well, this has been a lot of fun and very funny, and I'm going to put a stop to that right now. I just want to warn you about that. But seriously, this has been good, and I'm glad to add my voice, share a few of my thoughts about this topic of mediation. In 2001, I published a book called The Amish in the American Imagination, where I traced the rising interest, rising fascination in the Old Order Amish in the United States over the course of the 20th century. So I basically started about 1900, and the book came out in 2001. So it's really about 100 years. Hardly any interest at all in the Old Order Amish in 1900, and I think by 2000, they're probably the most recognizable religious group on the American landscape. You know, nobody knows what a Presbyterian is. Everybody knows who the Amish are. So I do a lot of things in that book. One of the chapters in that book is on the Hollywood film Witness that was released in 1984, remains the most commercially successful Amish-themed feature film of all time. I thought it was a pretty good film. I still think it's a pretty good film. But my chapter on Witness in the book devotes less attention to the film than it does to the controversy that revolved around the film. And again, the film feels very tame now. But there was a big controversy in 1984. And in particular, I focused on the protests that were spearheaded by John A. Hostetler, who at that time in the 1980s was clearly the premier scholar of Amish life. And more than that, he was deeply respected by many influential Amish church leaders. My take on John's protest work in my book, my take on his work is rather negative on two counts. First, I felt that he overplayed the damage the film would do to Amish life. And second, I felt that he used his own authority in Amish communities to get at least some Amish people riled up about the film, and then reported to the media that Amish people were riled up about the film. In other words, this is my take. This is a situation where the world's premier mediator of Amish life was actually creating the reality that he was mediating. I'm not sure that he recognized that, but even if he was aware of it, I think he felt that that sort of thing was justified because of what I just noted, that he thought Witness really would have adverse effects on Amish life. And again, I think he was wrong about that, but he was acting in the time. He wasn't acting looking back in time. Now let me jump ahead to a different sort of mediation work, a very 21st century phenomenon. Some of you are aware of my wife Valerie's book on Amish romance novels, titled Thrill of the Chaste, The Allure of Amish Romance Novels. It's a great book, and you should ask for it for Christmas. And one of the reasons it's great, at least in my estimation, is it's very generous to the readers of those novels. My wife is not one of those, or at least she wasn't one. And I often told her that I can't believe I'm married to you reading this Amish romance novel one after another, but it was true, that's what she did. But she really was generous to the readers, and some of those readers that she interviewed and talked to really don't read much of anything else. They read those novels one after another. Almost all of those novels, and there are hundreds of them out there, almost all of them are written by outsiders. Most of them are written by non-Amish women of an evangelical Christian bent. It probably goes without saying, but scholars of Amish life, that is, people like me, are not big fans of these romance novels, mostly because we're jealous. And we also know that they are probably more effective in shaping people's views on Amish life than our own relatively dry, dusty works have been. Now, I could take a long time talking about these novels as vehicles for mediating Amish life, but the one thing I want to note this evening is the fact that lots of Amish people read them, particularly Amish women, particularly young Amish women. And that fact makes me wonder, and Valerie at least asked this question in her book, how much power these romance novels have in shaping Amish life. So something of the same question about John Hostetler as a mediator shaping Amish life. Just one quick anecdote in this regard. I take my students to Lancaster County on a field trip. We have lunch in an Amish home. I know the woman who serves the meal. I know her very well. She has a time for questions afterwards. And one of my students asked whether, when Amish get engaged, whether the young man goes to the Amish parents, at least the Amish father, and asks for his daughter's hand in marriage. And Sally's response was something like this: it seems as if all the kids do it that way nowadays. Okay, so she's in her late 40s. Seems like all the kids do it that way now. But when we were that age, 20 years ago, we just went ahead and told our parents, we're getting married. Now, I don't have proof of that, of this, but I'm suspicion that that current practice in Lancaster County, where the young man goes and talks to his fiance's parents, I'm curious whether that's fueled by some stories in Amish romance novels where that happens. And again, I don't know whether that's true, but I am suspicious of where that practice came from in the last 10 or 15 years. Now, that may not be a big deal, but it also makes me wonder about other assumptions that are embedded in evangelical Christianity, where these novels are whether these novels are vehicles for injecting other evangelical Christian values into Old Order Amish life, which traditionally haven't been very evangelical. So, let me move on to a very different moment in time, very different genre, and ask a couple questions about it. 2004, a network called the UPN Network created a reality series called Amish in the City. It was the first, I think, in the reality series genre that featured real Amish kids on screen playing themselves. Now, they were a little older, disaffected Amish kids. They probably hadn't been very active in their communities, their churches for a while, but they were Amish. They were born Amish. They had Amish families, hadn't joined the church, but they were born Amish. The city that the Amish went into was Los Angeles. There were 5 of the Amish kids. They're put in a house with 5 non-Amish teens, and then the world gets to see how things play out with these 5 Amish kids and the 5 worldly kids. Now, when I saw that first episode, and again, this is 2004, 13, 14 years ago, I was stunned, okay? It all seems pretty tame now after Breaking Amish and some other things, but I was stunned. I was amazed that the producers had gotten these Amish teens to live out their lives on screen like that, and I was amazed that the network would have the audacity to pay kids a lot of money to do that. And if I recall correctly, the way they got these kids involved is they ran advertisements in newspapers looking for, did you grow up in an Amish home? Would you like to be a TV star? Contact us. Here's the number, okay? Some outsiders, protective of the Amish, were very upset by this. This was after I had published my book and talked about John Hostetler, and I decided I wasn't going to hop onto that. This is so terrible, it's going to ruin the Amish train. I wasn't going to do that, but I did get pulled in a rather strange way. Our local UPN affiliate in Harrisburg realized that there were a lot of people in central Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, where I live, an hour from Lancaster, that were quite upset about the show. So this local affiliate, rather than airing it the first night they could, decided to delay the showing until, they could get some input. I was a little naive, you'll find out. So they invited me, along with a few other people, to a gathering to discuss the propriety of airing a show such as this. I can't remember much of what I said at that meeting. What I mostly remember is that when I showed up for the conversation, they had some of their camera people there to film our conversation. Parts of which they then showed on the evening news. Now, again, I was naive. I probably should have left at that point. As you might guess, the things I said were really carefully selected to show me saying, don't worry, it's not really that bad. It's not going to ruin Amish life, which is really what I thought, but I didn't really like being used that way to endorse a product that I thought really shouldn't be shown. Although it was hard to articulate, like, why shouldn't it be shown? If nothing else, it gave me a little more insight into what it means not only to be a mediator of Amish life, but to be mediated myself, which is what happened that day. So with that, let me move on to my final example, which was my role as an expert, as a kind of go-to scholar for the media in the aftermath of the Nickel Mines school shooting in 2006. Most of you are probably aware of that event when a non-Amish man entered an Amish schoolhouse, chased out the teachers and the boys, and ended up shooting 10 Amish girls, killing 5 of them. In the days and weeks after that event, I should say the hours actually, and days and weeks after that event, I got dozens of phone calls from news reporters wanting me to comment on the event, wanting me to comment on the Amish response, and particularly the Amish quick extension of forgiveness to the perpetrator, which is the story that kind of took over after a day or so. One of the things that struck me at that time was just how uninformed some of the reporters' questions were. One of the reporters asked me this, and I'm pretty sure this is a direct quote: "How did the gunman get onto the reservation?" Which of course made me want to ask, do you realize that the Amish and Native Americans are different? Is that right? So I was occasionally unimpressed by the reporters, but actually the more I thought about it, especially in retrospect, the more sympathetic I became. We academics talk about deadlines, but mostly it's to confess that I think I'm going to miss that deadline. These reporters had real deadlines. Some of them probably didn't know anything about Amish life at 8 a.m., but their editor said to them, "I need a story by 5 p.m. And so they had a few hours to learn things that people like me took decades to learn. And with that in mind, I came to appreciate even the silliest of questions. Let me say 2 more things about my experience with Nickel Mines and then I'll be done. My biggest quandary in the midst of all that, and it was a quandary that came up pretty quickly, was should I write a book about the event and the aftermath? I had never to that point have publishers call me and ask me to write a book, but I had published some op-eds in the Philadelphia paper and the Pittsburgh paper, and those led to phone calls from publishers that said, "We would be glad to have you write a book." You've heard of ambulance-chasing lawyers. Did I want to become an ambulance-chasing scholar? Finally, although I wanted to have more time to think about it, finally I decided that helping the larger public understand the Amish response was more important than some of the other concerns I had, reservations about writing a book. I ended up writing it with two fellow scholars, Don Grebel and Steve Nolt. It somehow felt better for us to work on a book together rather than do our own books that might be competing books. We decided to donate all the royalties to Mennonite Central Committee that came out of that book, which had been a significant amount. Ultimately, we received what I would say was the blessing of the families that were involved, who thought we did a pretty good job with the story, although we didn't get that blessing up front, and we weren't going to wait for it. We decided that we were going to tell the story, and we're happy later that they were pleased with what we had done. So that's one thing. Here's the second thing. We really did our best to explain the Amish response of forgiving the gunman, reaching out to his family, using words of forgiveness with the gunman's family. We listened to Amish people, originally not direct family members, but along the way some family members. We listened to them talk about their response. We listened to them as they talked about what forgiveness meant to them. We worked hard to come up with what we felt was a good definition of forgiveness, like what does that actually mean when you say I forgive, or what does it mean to actually work through a process till you get to the point of forgiveness. And we explained, or at least did our best to explain, how it was possible for Amish people to talk about forgiveness as something that you could do very quickly, almost immediately, even in a very awful circumstance like this, but still have forgiveness as something that you're working out and struggling through over time. I think we did a pretty good job at that, and I know that there have been a lot of readers who have appreciated that kind of careful discussion of forgiveness. But one time at an event, something like this, after I had talked about the book, I got this question, or I guess it's really more of a comment from somebody in the audience. It went something like this: I can't quite tell when you're talking about how the Amish think about forgiveness and when you're talking about how you think about forgiveness. Okay, so I can't quite figure out when you're giving me the Amish view or when you're saying this is your view of what forgiveness entails. And I think my answer went something like this. I find their views compelling, very much in line with my own thinking as a Mennonite. So I'm not sure there's a great deal of difference. But I still wonder. I wonder if I was doing what I accused John Hostetler of doing, and that is projecting my own views onto the Amish subjects that I was claiming to represent. And I suspect that's a problem that other panelists are wrestling with tonight. So, with that, I think we'll go to panel.
So we're going to continue our conversation, and we will shortly draw in you as the audience. I'm inviting our panelists up here, and we'll ask Mark to bring the mic over to our group of four there. So we've heard a real diversity of how we tell Mennonite and Amish stories, and it's been a really good presentation so far. But I'm not going to talk very much. I have a whole list of questions here myself, but I think we're going to start and invite you, Dave, if you want to ask a question or comment for any of our panelists about what they've said, and we'll start there. And then whether any of you have a question or comment for Dave, but we'll give you the first word.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that come to mind. I thought I'd start by asking Sam a question. I talked about John Hostetler and his concerns, and you talked about this documentary, Pure, and how angry you felt about what you saw. And I guess I'm curious whether you saw that documentary as potentially doing real harm to the people that were being represented, or whether you were more just angry about
misrepresentations, the lack of concern about the truth and accuracy.
I guess with the drama series Pure, I wouldn't have worried so much about the impact on the group itself, but I thought it distorted the public's view of these groups. I had gone to the CBC's website on the Pure series and looked at all the comments that were coming from there as the series was unfolding, and there was an incredible amount of unknowledge, I guess, on that website, and people making statements about how this was true, or this is really what they understood, or they knew Mennonite communities that were like this, and so forth. So I guess there was less concern about the impact on the community itself, but more about how the public was reading this as somehow connected to reality.
Do any of you want to ask a question or give a comment to Dave?
I actually, just because I also wrote on Pure, so if I can also talk about that. Some of the things that I saw on Mennonite Twitter following Pure, my take on it was, I used the show to reflect upon like how upset we'd all be about having two different groups conflated together. And but what I saw on Mennonite Twitter, I saw a lot of like former old colony Mennonites who were upset about it. There were people who were upset on behalf of the old order, but there were also a lot of old colony Mennonites who felt like their story had been stolen from them. And it is a story that it's some of their pain, and it's a real story, and then by casting it in this other group. So I hadn't, when I wrote my post, I hadn't been thinking about harm that's done, but then I was seeing it's not like it was an outpouring, there were only a few voices, but people who were really making this claim that, it did hurt.
I'm just curious about that phrase, stole our story, or stolen our story. I mean, was that a response because it was such a negatively pitched sort of story, or would that comment be the same if the documentarian had done a very glowing or more balanced view of that?
In this case, I think it's because the old colony Mennonite are less. They just have. I think they at least perceive themselves as having lower status, and then to be portrayed as Amish older or older Mennonites. I guess that's what it was kind of a conglomeration, right? I don't even know what they were portrayed as, but closer to older Mennonites. It felt to them. I mean, it wasn't a great. I don't know that they really want to be always portrayed as drug dealers, but on the other hand, they didn't want to be erased.
If any of you are not familiar with the show Pure, a CBC television series last winter, it may be still, I'm sure you can find it on YouTube somewhere. Do you think we sometimes protest too much? And I was among those responding to Pure, and sometimes I listened to myself, and I caught myself, and I said, really, do we expect people out there to get the 30 different kinds of Mennonites and their nuances? Why do we want them to get it right? And by them, I mean the non-Mennonite media and the general them.
I mean, I've been in academic gatherings too where people make fun of the outsider's lack of understanding of all the distinctions. And I felt that same thing, that I can't keep them all straight. And I've been working at this for so long. So I do think that there is a sense of kind of looking down on the ordinary people who can't keep this all straight. I do think some of it comes down to our assessment of whether real harm is being done by some of the conflation of groups or some of the misrepresentation. I do wonder about something that portrays people in such negative light, and I haven't seen Pure, whether that is a time to speak out in a way that some of the reality shows. In the reality shows, I felt mostly sorry for the young people that get involved. I don't think they know what they're doing. I don't think they know what they're buying into and how that may affect their lives in the long term. So I feel sorry for them. I don't see a lot of adverse effects to Amish life generally.
Are there any topics that are out of bounds, whether by any of you who write about Mennonites, or do you think there are any topics that are, out of bounds, off bounds, what's the expression, you know what I mean, for the media or for non-Mennonite writers?
So within our plays, the most common negative feedback is how we portray Mennonite pastors. In most of our plays, I would say most of our plays, we have some kind of pastoral figure. Now typically I write kind of ideologically, and so the pastoral figures kind of represent how like the big C church is kind of navigating whatever issue it might be. And I think that maybe that is where it becomes problematic, because it doesn't kind of, it almost looks like there's this kind of head figure which doesn't kind of fall in line with like the one is the body kind of idea. But most negative critiques that we've got are not about necessarily even like the language that we use, like if there's swearing in a play or if it's like a really intense issue, but it's more about like that's not what a Mennonite pastor is like. Kind of like you leave them alone, which I've found really interesting, and I've tried my best to defend and stuff. But I've always found that to be, it kind of confuses me, I guess.
So making people look bad.
Yeah, but specifically pastors.
There are like a lot of topics that I just can't make fun. And that's kind of, some of my blog posts are less funny than others, but those are the ones there are definitely, sort of painful topics that, and I don't want to hurt people, like I said, no sort of the individual ad hominem attacks and things like that I won't do.
Can you say what those are?
What the things that I can't make funny? Sexual abuse in the church, I can't make that funny, maybe. It's not going to be your next play. Your next play is no, it's not going to be a comedy. That's the one just hit. I haven't done anything about Mennonite relations with Indigenous people. I've tried, and I can't have the voice. Like I just can't make it funny yet. Maybe I will be able to, but.
I think for me, content that I would consider kind of out of bounds for my own presentation is just kind of what I was mentioning earlier, Mennonite stories that I don't feel like are my own. So I don't want to speak for other people. I can only talk about my own experience as an assimilated Swiss Mennonite from Southern Ontario. And because I feel like I'm one of the few people online kind of talking about Mennonites, I especially don't want to make it seem like I can speak to other people's experiences.
Any topics off bounds for you, Sam?
I guess because of the way I write, there are probably not a lot that would be out of bounds. I haven't talked about sexual abuse in the church, I don't think, but I've talked about sexuality and I've talked about criminal behavior and things like that within the Mennonite community. But I'm writing as a historian, sort of doing a narrative of things that have happened. I try to keep a neutral voice when I'm talking about groups that are plain. Some of the others have talked about this as well. In the preface of my book, I talked about I'm an assimilated Mennonite, but I'm trying to write neutrally about the other groups, and I've been gratified by what some of those groups have said, or seem to feel that I did them justice. But so when I go into writing, I do try to, I think consciously about writing neutrally, and trying to not make judgments about where people have come out when there's been a division or something like that. But that, again, that's easier. I'm not trying to be funny, so it's probably easier to work at the issue that way.
Do you have any comments to that?
Just one, and I don't do a lot of research going into Amish communities and doing research there. Most of my interest has been on representational issues over the years, but I do sympathize with people that do that sort of research and then write. The pressure I think they feel to not be too negative, even if there are negative things that they see, because access is very important to being able to do Amish research in old order groups. You need to have access. You need to have people who are willing to talk to you or pave the way for you to talk to others. And when you begin to speak negatively to the larger public about what you see, that access can disappear. So I think we need to recognize that in some of these scholars who do work on Amish life, that there are some things that are, I mean, whitewashing is probably too strong of a statement, but it is very hard to be critical without losing access to the people that the community you're trying to research.
You spoke briefly about responding to the Amish in the City show, and something was, you were quoted, and you wished you hadn't said it or wished you could take it back. I'll ask you that question again, but then the rest of you, have you ever put something out there that you wished you could take back but couldn't?
Oh, yeah, for me, most of what I've put out there that I wish I could take back would be these instances of talking to the news media that's going to select out of what I've said. They're going to pick the quotation that's most colorful. They're going to paste it in without larger context. And it's at least led some colleagues I know in the area of religious studies that have just decided, I am not talking to the news media about these things, because they know that their words, their statements are going to be edited in a way that may be an accurate quote as much as you see. I haven't felt that I've been too badly misquoted, but the larger context disappears and the complexity of what I'm trying to represent disappears. So that's been my issue.
Any of you? Nothing?
I don't think I have anything in particular that I would want to take back. I do think with some of my older videos now, I wish that I maybe would have been more well-researched or kind of had more information. I started making my Mennonite YouTube videos when I was 15 or 16. So I didn't have a lot of the same knowledge that I have now, having almost completed a Mennonite Studies minor. So for me, it's not, all of my education, not quite done my undergrad. But anyway, for me, it's not that I regret it necessarily, but I do feel like now I'm in a position to probably make content that's a bit more well-informed.
I mean, one of the great things about the internet is you can take it back. I have gone and edited things after people have corrected it. I've been sort of usually minor things. I've never taken down a whole post. I don't know if I've even deleted a tweet, but I could if I wanted to. So it doesn't really feel, it doesn't feel that kind of permanence.
I would say with our plays, some of our plays we perform 60 something times, and so after a show, if we have a talk back or if we connect with the audience, if they have things like, oh, this didn't line up, or you should rethink this, or hey, what about this idea, like, that's the kind of cool thing about a play, is that it's organic and we can just rewrite it for the next performance and we can change it. And so I would say if there's things that I wish we had done differently, then we just change it by the next play. Yeah.
Wonderful when you can just keep rewriting history,
Yeah.
right? So I'm going to turn it over to the audience, but wondering if, before I do that, if you have a question or comment for each other. Okay. Questions or responses? Do we have another mic, or maybe people could just speak very loudly, and if necessary, I will repeat. So I think Kyle?
Just a word of clarification, Pure is a drama, it's fiction.
It's a drama, okay.
But one of my questions is, why tell the story? And when I listen to what I've been hearing, a lot of it is cultural. How much of it is faith? And I think the faith element, when I think of Pure, part of what's being challenged is the faith. And that's, I think, where the rub comes. Although there are also issues of culture that are not researched and could have been done much better.
Sherri or Sam, you want to respond to that since you talked about Pure?
It sounded more like a comment than a question. What was it? It was about culture versus faith, particularly in Pure?
The real question was, why tell the story at all? Why is it important for us to tell the Mennonite story?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure it is. Maybe someone else should answer this.
And you're asking why it's important for those of us here to do it, or why is it important for the network to do it?
In general, why should we care about telling the Mennonite story?
Maybe say something about it. I think for me, I kind of like alluded to this in what I was talking about earlier, but I think representation is really important. So when I think of my answer to this question, why do we tell the Mennonite story? Well, it's for ourselves. I'm not like hugely concerned about, I guess, representing it to the outside world, and maybe that's narcissistic, I don't know, but I think there's something like, I don't know, beautiful about telling stories to our own community and passing that on.
So I mentioned that I'm not Mennonite. I was raised evangelical missionary and left the church maybe second year of university, and then have basically was wrestling for many years after that. But because of my time spent at Grebel and the majority of my friends were Mennonites, I found myself kind of in this Mennonite community and found myself welcomed despite my questions or lack of certainty in the Mennonite community. And I've often said that if it wasn't for the Mennonite church, I guess the assimilated Mennonite church, that I probably would have never darkened the doorways of a church ever again. But I've probably been in more churches than most Mennonites. I've probably spoken at Mennonite, pulpits more than in terms of a wide variety. All of a sudden I found that I have this voice in the Mennonite community. And it's something that I really wrestle with. Half the time I feel like a charlatan, and half the times I feel really quite honored. And I think for me it comes down to having found a community who encourages the types of values that I want. And so when I see those types of values promoted as things that people hold dear, that excites me. But then at the same time, when I see things that are at a cognitive dissonance with those values, where it says everyone is welcome except you, and you, then that really ticks me off, because it's like, hey, it was because of this stuff that I felt like I wanted to hang out with you people. And now with this stuff over here, it's like, I don't know how I feel about that. And so for me, having a voice of theater within this community is a way of me kind of sticking around this community to say, I care about you folks, I really appreciate that you welcomed me, but I do also have some things to add. And I think what's so interesting about the Mennonite community is that, like I mentioned, they're typically willing to listen as long as you are also willing to listen. And so that's a really beautiful balance. But also, any community, as insular as the Mennonite community is, when examined at like a micro level, becomes a really beautiful microcosm of community in general. Like we wrote a play about an ex-offender, so someone who has got out of prison trying to reintegrate into a church community. And that church community became a metaphor for the greater community, and how that church responded to him was a metaphor of how society responds to offenders in general. And so the church itself can become a very powerful metaphor or allegory when you're looking at larger, more complex topics.
Yeah, perhaps a question about whether there's a story here that's just in the making in relation to the boycotting of the NRA and the historical Mennonite stance of non-resistance, peace, not use of guns, and is there, how is that one going to play out, or should it play out, or should we forget about that?
Is there humor there? Or is How is that playing out in the Mennonite Amish community, do you know, in the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a comment on that. You know, there are assumptions about the Amish in particular that they don't have guns, but they do. And so, I mean, that's part of the story when people are surprised to hear that. The Amish like to hunt and often have guns. It's a very different thing than having, you know, AR-15s and AK-47s. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have an answer to that question of how Mennonite church people are going to enter into that. I mean, I'm in a part of the Mennonite world and go to a Mennonite church where, you know, half of my fellow church members voted for Donald Trump. And so we're in a situation where the minister just stays away from those sorts of things. We probably need to have Johnny come in and do a play for us. I think that might be better. But, you know, I wish it weren't that way, but that's the way it is. And his choice is just, you know, to not talk about those sort of political issues from the pulpit.
I think Troy and then Kyle. Speak loudly, Troy.
Yeah, I hear there's some reluctance to act as sort of gatekeepers to some of the groups who don't want to speak in media. But do you find that the Amish appreciate that role that some people play, that somebody else is speaking for them, or that conservative Mennonites? I mean, do they rely on Mennonite, assimilated Mennonites to serve as the sort of spokesperson or gatekeeper?
Yeah, I think they appreciate that, especially if they can find someone who holds the Amish community and its values in high esteem and can articulate some of those values to outsiders. And so, I mean, John Hostetler was the classic person in that regard for years. Herman Bontrager does some of that now. Some of you may know Herman, who lives in the Lancaster area, at least for that community in the aftermath of nickel mines. He was very close to the families and helped present some of their views to the larger public in the months that followed. So I think many Amish people do appreciate that, although there's diversity of opinion in the community as well about some of those things, and I think sometimes feel like that person is not speaking for us or not speaking for me. But I do think that a lot of, and I know the Lancaster County area the best, a lot of the bishops are glad to have somebody who knows their community well and can speak to the public in an articulate way.
This is kind of a follow-up question to your comment, David, about, and it's for the entire panel, regarding Mennonites as consumers of media. And I really was compelled by what you said about the way that these Amish romance novels have possibly introduced subtle change. And that fear of the influence of media and change in the community is as old as the Mennonite community itself. Drama has been, I remember my parents speaking pejoratively about drama in the sanctuary because it was suspicious. Right? We go back 100 years and just the fear of novels, Mennonite novels being dangerous kinds of things. So I'm wondering if you can either expound on that some more, David, or others of you? What are the ethics of self-representation? Are we consuming more media because we see ourselves represented by ourselves more? Yeah.
So the question has to do with Mennonites as consumers of media, and I am fascinated by the idea that many Mennonites are readers of these Amish romance novels too. I talked about the Amish being readers of them, and I'm not quite always sure what to make of that sort of interest in those particular novels. I do think that the more obvious response, though, to outsiders representing us, whether that's us as Mennonites or us as Anabaptist communities, is the assumption, and this came up some in one of the talks, is that outsiders shouldn't be doing this, or somehow that outsiders are always going to get this wrong. Why do they think that they should have, the right to do that sort of thing? And, I find that response a very curious one. That we would never flip it around and say that, well, only Mormons can represent Mormons, or only Muslims can represent Muslims, and that if the rest of us are doing that, there's something inappropriate about that. So I do find that particular sense among Mennonites kind of curious.
I actually think people do say that. I mean, it's about appropriation of voice again, and certainly the indigenous people are really saying that, that, we shouldn't be telling other people's stories. And like Katie, I sort of avoid those areas where I know less and try to acknowledge what I know less about. But the question was about us as consumers of media. So I think about the people, yes, I consume a lot. Whether, like I said, I think my core audience are not people who are really, they're already consuming a lot of media. And so seeing themselves, enjoying the little inside jokes. Sometimes, like Katie mentioned, there's a lot of people who have Mennonite background but aren't connected, and they may connect through Twitter or through YouTube. And they're so I don't know. I see it may be having an impact there. I don't know. I find it difficult to see it as a problem.
The question of what sort of the outsiders, to use that term, think about Mennonites, and whether we think they should talk about Mennonites and Amish. It feels like, to me, there's a combination of we revere them, but we're suspicious. So we revere them because, they're interested in us and they want to talk about us, but yet we're suspicious of, will they get it right? Sam, were you about to say something?
I think about this in a little bit different way of particularly how some conservative groups are trying to manage the way their people interact with media. Some of them by creating a lot more media themselves. The number of conservative Mennonite groups that publish periodicals now, or old order Mennonite groups now publish periodicals, or you have specialty periodicals put out by Amish women in Holmes County or something like that. That's one way I think a certain kind of Mennonites have tried to deal with media to try and keep their community within a certain range. I was also fascinated a few years ago about how some conservative conferences who have taken the step toward accepting the internet have tried to manage that. with the mutual accountability that they demand of each other, so that someone else within your community monitors what you're seeing on the internet, and other ways that they work at that. And those are fascinating approaches in addressing how you deal with the public media within your circle.
I think maybe we'll have one more question. Go ahead, John.
I think we've been talking about mediation with the media, but Old Order and Amish, their relationship with the general society is mediated in many ways, particularly economic. I mean, they've got to get the products that they don't consume themselves out to market. In Waterloo County, you have in barns sophisticated plastic extrusion manufacturing with diesel generators that are producing things for cars and for the New Jersey subway system. When you have that level of sophistication in one area, but you choose not to do it with the media, isn't it a little bit pretentious or maybe even condescending to take up that role to mediate with the media when they could do it themselves?
You say when they could do it themselves?
Yes.
I mean that they could choose to do that sort of thing without needing people like me. I guess I have a couple of responses to that. They don't often. They haven't traditionally done that, and people have questions. I'm an educator. I answer those questions. I do it in the classroom. Should I do it to the larger public? So in some ways I fill a void that they have chosen not to take. At the same time, and this maybe go to your question, Herald Press, the Mennonite Church media publisher, has a series now called Plainspoken. And Plainspoken is a way for Amish people, Old Order people, other conservative people to tell their own stories. Some choose to do that. Some choose to do that through Herald Press. As Sam talked about, some have other vehicles where they do that, although primarily those vehicles are directed toward an Amish readership. Sometimes outsiders get interested in those and can subscribe or participate in those, but again, their messages in those are primarily focused toward another audience. So I don't know if that gets to your question. They could, they usually don't, and educators, scholars, other media people fill the void.
Well, I think we could have lots more conversation, and maybe you'd like to linger and talk to our panelists and Dr. Weaver-Zercher and amongst each other. It's been a rich presentation of many ways of telling Mennonite stories. I'd like to close first of all by thanking you, Lester Bechtel, and your family for supporting Anabaptist-Mennonite Studies here at Conrad Grebel and making this lectureship happen, so thank you again. Thanks to our four media personalities who are here. I think you'll have some more followers after tonight. And thank you for undertaking to be out there and talking about who Mennonites and Amish and others are. So it's, thank you. And in particular, thank you to you, Dave, for being here for the last 2 days and bringing your ideas and expertise here. It's been a pleasure, and thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for coming.